Tonight, let us go somewhere very old. Not to a place you have visited before, not to a country drawn on any modern map, but to a land that once lay between two slow rivers, in a flat and marshy plain where the sky seemed endless and the earth smelled of wet clay and river grass. Settle in. Let the room around you grow quiet. Let the noise of the day drain away like water seeping into warm soil. This story will take its time. It moves the way water moves through a canal at dusk. Slowly, steadily, carrying you forward without hurry. There is nowhere else you need to be.
We are going back more than 5,000 years to the place the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Two long threads of water stitching through a dry and ancient plain, feeding the reeds, filling the canals, turning dust into dark soil where barley could grow.
This is where the first cities rose from mud brick and bundled reed. Eridu, Ur, Uruk, Nippur, names pressed into clay tablets by scribes who sat cross-legged in temple courtyards, writing with the cut edge of a reed stylus, line by careful line, in a script we call cuneiform. Small wedge-shaped marks, thousands of them, recording laws, debts, prayers, and stories. Among the oldest of those stories are the myths you will hear tonight. They are the tales the Sumerians told about the beginning of everything. Where the world came from, how the gods were born, why human beings were made, and what happened when the gods grew tired of the noise their creations made. These myths were not fixed in one version. They shifted and deepened over centuries, retold by Babylonians and Akkadians who inherited the old gods and gave them new names and new adventures. What you will hear is the full arc of that mythological tradition, woven from many sources into a single long journey through a world older than memory. There will be gods of storm and gods of water. There will be a flood that swallows the earth and a goddess who walks through the gates of death. There will be a king who searches the edges of the world for the secret of eternal life and comes home, at last, with empty hands and quiet eyes. But none of it will be loud. The old world unfolds gently here, one image at a time, like lamplight moving slowly across the surface of a dark river. There is no hurry in these stories. They were first told by people who lived close to the rhythms of flood and harvest, who measured their years by the rising and falling of rivers. Picture, if you can, a night sky over southern Iraq, the same sky those ancient people watched. The stars are the same ones. The constellations have shifted only slightly in 5,000 years. The wind still carries the faint smell of the marshes, where water birds settle among the reeds at dusk, and the surface of the water holds the last orange light of the sun. Somewhere beneath that sky, long ago a scribe sat in a courtyard lit by a single oil lamp. He held a reed stylus in his fingers and pressed it into a tablet of fresh clay, recording words that had been spoken aloud for generations before him. He was writing down the oldest story his people knew, the story of how all things began. Let us begin where he began. Let us go back past every city, past every king, past every name that was ever pressed into clay, back to the silence before the first dawn, when nothing existed in all of creation but the slow, dark, breathing water. Chapter 1, the Primordial Sea. Before heaven and earth, before name or form, there was only water, vast, dark, and without boundary. Imagine a darkness that has no edge, not the darkness of a room where walls give shape to shadow, but a darkness that stretches in every direction without limit. No floor beneath you, no ceiling above, no horizon line ahead. Only water, turning over itself in slow currents that have no name and no destination. This is where the oldest Mesopotamian stories begin. Not with a god standing on a mountaintop, not with a voice commanding light into being, but with water. Silent, formless, immeasurably deep. A primordial ocean that existed before anything else, before stone, before sky, before the very idea of direction. The Sumerians, who were among the first to press this story into clay, called this original sea Nammu. She was not a goddess in the way one might picture. No throne, no carved face, no temple built in her honor. She was the water itself, the source of all sources, the mother of everything that would eventually come into existence. Nammu had no shore. Her body was the universe entire, stretching beyond any measurement into a darkness no eye could penetrate. She was neither still nor violent. She moved the way deep ocean currents move, with a patience that makes centuries feel like the passing of a single breath. In the later Babylonian retelling, composed in a text scholars call the Enuma Elish, this single primordial ocean was imagined as two natures held within one darkness. One was sweet and cool, the kind of water that rises in underground springs and feeds the roots of date palms. They called this Abzu, the deep fresh water beneath the earth. The other nature was salt, heavy, mineral-rich, restless with tide. The great bitter sea that stretched beyond the farthest shore, swallowing everything at the edge of the known world. They called this Tiamat, a name that scholars believe comes from the old word for sea, spoken with awe by people who lived on a flat plain. This image may not have been mere invention. Where the rivers of southern Mesopotamia empty into the Persian Gulf, fresh water meets salt water along a visible boundary. The two do not blend easily. They press against each other, each holding its own color and density, swirling in slow, patient opposition. The people who watched this meeting of waters may have imagined the beginning of all things. Abzu was quiet. He was the deep stillness beneath the ground, the underground reservoir that fed every well and every canal. His nature was patience and containment. He moved without sound through veins of stone and sand. If you knelt beside a riverbank at dusk and pressed your ear to the damp earth, the faint pulse of water you felt might have been Abzu breathing far below. Tiamat was vast. She was the open sea itself, the salt tide, the rolling surface that devoured the horizon. Her body stretched beyond any coast that had yet been formed. She was not cruel in those first days, nor kind. She simply was, enormous, restless, older than anything that would follow her. Her moods were the moods of the open ocean. Together, in that darkness before the world existed, these two waters moved against each other. Not as enemies, not as lovers in the way later poets might describe, but as two forces whose natures made contact inevitable. Where Abzu's cool sweetness met Tiamat's heavy brine, something began to happen at the boundary between them. A thickening, a residue. Like silt collecting at the bottom of a river where two tributaries meet. The first sediment of the universe, gathering grain by grain in the dark, accumulating in a process so slow that no mind could measure it. The waters churned and the sediment built, and in the building, something stirred that was not water at all. From this primordial silt, the earliest beings took shape. They were not gods as later stories would describe them. Powerful, named, seated on thrones of lapis lazuli, they were more like thickenings in the darkness. Presences that formed from the slow meeting of two ancient forces, the way mud forms where rivers slow and settle. The first among these beings were called Lammu and Lahamu. They existed at the threshold between fresh water and salt, between stillness and motion, between nothing and the faintest something. In later centuries, Babylonian sculptors would carve them as temple guardians, calm figures with flowing beards and watchful eyes, standing beside great doorways of cedarwood and bronze. But in the beginning, Nammu and Lahamu were simply the first solidification, the first proof that the primordial sea could produce something other than itself. Their forms were indistinct, half liquid, half mineral, patient as stone waiting to harden beneath the weight of ages. No one spoke their names. No prayer reached them in the deep. They drifted and merged and separated and merged again, endlessly, in a rhythm older than rhythm. Time meant nothing in that place. There were no days to count, no moons to mark the passage of seasons. Nammu and Lahamu were the first threshold, the boundary between the formless and the formed, and from that boundary, all things would eventually emerge. Perhaps, if you could have stood in that place, though there was no place to stand and no one to stand there, you would have felt a faint warmth at the boundary where the two waters met. A warmth that had no source, a tremor in the silt, like the first heartbeat of something that did not yet have a heart. The sediment kept gathering, the waters kept turning, and somewhere in the deepest fold of that lightless ocean, a new pair of forces began to take shape, forces that would give the universe, for the first time, an orientation. Something like a sense of above, something like a memory of below. These new beings were called Anshar and Kishar. They were not made of silt like their parents. They were harder, more defined, the first things in the universe that possessed edges. Anshar reached upward. Kishar pressed downward. Between them, the vaguest suggestion of a line began to form in the dark. It was not yet a horizon, not yet a boundary between sky and ground, but it was the idea of one, the possibility that the universe might someday have a shape, a direction, a sense that here was different from there. The formless sea shivered as though something fundamental had changed within it. From Anshar and Kishar, in the fullness of immeasurable time, came another pair, beings more solid still. Their names were Anu and Ki. Anu, whose body was hard as lapis lazuli, dark and faintly gleaming with blue-green light in the deep, and Ki, whose body was softer, like damp earth after rain, warm and rich with the quiet promise of life. Sky and ground, heaven and earth. They lay pressed together so tightly that no breath could pass between them. No light entered the seam where Anu's stone met Ki's soil. They were a single mass locked in an embrace so complete that even the oldest waters could not find a gap between them. But that was still far away, far down in the patient dark. For now, there was only water and silt, and the breathing of the oldest beings in creation, resting in silence, waiting for the next slow change to begin. The Sumerians understood that creation does not start with a shout. It starts with a stirring in the deep, quiet as dust settling on a temple floor. And if you listen closely enough tonight, if you let the silence hold you, you can almost hear it still. The oldest water in the universe, turning over itself in the dark, carrying the first grains of what will someday become the world. Chapter 2, The Generations of the Gods. From silt to stone, from stone to sky, each generation grew more solid, more defined, more certain of its place in the dark. The beings called Anshar and Kishar did not arrive suddenly. Nothing in that first age arrived suddenly. They emerged the way crystals form in a cooling cave. Slowly, silently, molecule by molecule, until something that was once invisible becomes unmistakable. The Primordial Sea barely noticed them at first. They were just another thickening in the deep. But Anshar and Kishar were different from their parents in a way that mattered. Nammu and Lahamu had been creatures of the boundary, existing between states, never fully one thing or another. Anshar and Kishar were the first beings in the universe to have direction. Anshar reached upward. Kishar pressed downward. They were the first axis drawn through the formless dark. Think of it this way. Before them, the universe was a sphere of water with no inside and no outside. After them, something had changed. There was now an up and a down. Not yet a sky, not yet a ground, but the gravitational memory of what sky and ground would eventually become. The darkness had gained its first invisible architecture. Anshar was vast and ascending. His nature was to rise, to thin, to stretch towards something above that did not yet exist. If you could have watched him in the dark, you might have seen a slow upward pull, like heat rising from stone on a warm evening, invisible to the eye, but unmistakable to the skin. Kishar was dense and descending. Her nature was to settle, to gather weight, to press downward into the deep places where water pools and sediment collects. She was the pull of gravity before gravity had a name. Where Anshar thinned and rose, Kishar thickened and sank. Between them, the first tension in creation stretched like a thread drawn taut in the dark. From this tension, from this long and patient pulling apart, the next generation formed. And these new beings were more solid than anything the universe had yet produced. Their names were Anu and Ki. With their arrival, the raw material of the world as we know it finally took shape. The substance of heaven and the substance of earth. Anu was the sky before there was a sky. His body was described in later texts as being like Lulu Danitu stone, a substance harder than anything else in creation, dark and faintly gleaming with blue-green light, the color of lapis lazuli seen by torchlight in a deep chamber. He was heavy and unyielding, simply present like a ceiling of rock that has always existed. Ki was the earth before there was an earth. Her substance was different from Anu's hardness. She was dense but yielding, wet and warm, like the dark soil along a riverbank after the spring floods have passed, thick with the scent of growth and the slow promise of roots. If Anu was the weight above, then Ki was the depth below. Patient, fertile, waiting. In those days before time had learned to move forward, Anu and Ki lay pressed together in the dark. There was no gap between them. Heaven rested directly on the face of the earth, stone against soil, weight against warmth, and nothing, not water, not air, not the faintest sliver of light, could pass between their bodies. Imagine two enormous hands pressed together, palm to palm, with no space between the fingers. That was the shape of the world. Anu above, vast as the sky would one day become. Ki below, rich as the earth would one day be. And between them, nothing but pressure and darkness, and a silence so deep it had weight. Nothing grew in that sealed world. Nothing moved. The potential for rivers lay hidden in Ki's body, but no river could flow where there was no space for water to travel. The shapes of mountains were folded into the earth, but they could not rise while heaven pressed down upon them. Everything waited, compressed, patient as a seed buried too deep in the soil. The older generations felt this arrangement as completeness. Abzu in his deep stillness, Tiamat in her restless salt tides, Lamu and Lahamu at their quiet threshold, Anshar and Kishar in their long tension, all of them accepted the sealed world as the natural order. The universe was closed, and nothing within it stirred or changed. It simply was. Each generation had been an advance, from liquid to silt, from silt to axis, from axis to solid matter. But each had been content to remain where it was. The waters did not wish to become stone. The silt did not long to become sky. Each generation settled into its nature and stayed. This was the deep patience of the primordial age, a willingness to exist without question. But between Anu and Ki, something different was happening. A pressure was building that had nothing to do with weight. It was more like the charge that gathers between clouds before lightning, invisible, growing, undeniable. The narrow seam of darkness, where stone met soil hummed, with a force that the older gods could feel in their ancient bodies. The waters of the outer sea trembled at their farthest edge. Lamu and Lahamu, those silent guardians of the threshold, shifted uneasily for the first time since they had formed. Even Anshar and Kishar, those steady pillars of direction, felt the tension change. Something was building between their grandchildren that would not be resolved by patience alone. In the Sumerian tradition, this moment was remembered as the true beginning of everything that mattered. Not the creation of water, not the forming of silt or stone, but the moment when the universe could no longer hold itself closed. The seal between heaven and earth had begun to crack, slowly and surely, like the first fracture in a dam before the water finds its way through. And in that pressed-together darkness, between a father of stone and a mother of soil, a new force drew its first breath. It was not a gentle breath. It was the first wind the universe had ever known, sudden, violent, irresistible. The being who breathed it would crack the world open. His name was Enlil, and the age of stillness was coming to its end. Chapter 3. The Separation of Heaven and Earth. In the space between a father's stone and a mother's soil, the wind was born, and the world cracked open. Enlil did not arrive the way his ancestors had. Every being before him had emerged slowly, crystallizing, settling, hardening over spans of time so vast that even the gods could not count them. But Enlil was the disruption. He was the first sudden thing in a universe that had known only patience, and from his very first moment, he was impossibly strong. He was born in that narrow darkness where heaven's stone pressed against earth's soil. But he did not remain there. His nature was wind, not the gentle breeze that would one day dry clothing on a rooftop, but the raw force of atmosphere itself, pressure seeking release, energy that refuses to be contained. The first exhalation of a universe that had been holding its breath. With that breath, the world broke open. Anu's enormous body, that ceiling of dark Lulu-Danitu stone, was lifted. Not gently, not gradually. Enlil forced his father upward with a violence that nothing in creation had imagined possible. The sky rose like a lid torn from a jar. The earth fell, and between them, for the first time in existence, there was space. Light entered the gap. Not sunlight. There was no sun yet, but a diffuse gray, sourceless illumination, the kind you see in the minutes before dawn, when the sky is not yet bright, but the darkness has lost its hold. For the first time, things could be seen. The surface of the earth lay exposed, wet and dark and grooved with ancient channels. Mountains appeared. They had always been there, folded into Ki's body, pressed flat beneath the weight of heaven. Now with that weight lifted, they rose, ridges of stone and clay emerging from the wet ground, like the spines of sleeping animals waking. Water drained from their flanks, pooling in the low places, cutting the first rivers into soft and yielding soil. Enlil's wind swept across this newborn landscape without rest. Where it blew, wet earth dried and hardened. Marshland became solid ground. Mud became the packed clay that would one day support the walls of cities. The wind carried moisture upward into the first clouds. It carried dust sideways, sculpting the first dunes. It moved through the world with the energy of something released. The Sumerians remembered Enlil not as one wind, but as many. There was the hot wind from the south that smelled of dust and distance. The cool wind from the north, carrying the memory of mountain snow. East wind, west wind, the small winds that played between buildings, and the great storms that flattened reed houses and sent fishermen scrambling for the shore. All of these were Enlil. Every gust, every breeze, every howling gale was an expression of a single god's tireless nature. He was the first mover, the one who gave the universe its motion. Before Enlil, everything was still. After him, nothing would ever be still again. The air itself was his body, and his body was everywhere. Above the wind-scoured earth, the sky settled into its permanent position. Later, Sumerian texts described 3 layers. The outermost shell was made of Anu's own substance, that impossibly hard stone, sealing the world against the primordial waters that still surged beyond creation's edge. The old ocean of Nammu pressed against it endlessly, and found no way through. The middle layer was the dwelling place of the gods. This was where Enlil would hold his throne, a vast realm of divine light and clear air, where the Anunnaki, the great assembly of the gods, would build their halls and hold their councils. No mortal being would ever set foot there. It existed above the clouds, above the storms, in a quiet reserved for divine ears alone. The lowest layer of the sky was made of jasper, blue-green stone, translucent and cool. Through this one, the heavenly bodies would one day travel their appointed paths. The moon, when it came to exist, would drift across this jasper ceiling. The sun would trace its arc along it. The stars would be pressed into its surface like tiny jewels set into the rim of a crown. But in these first moments after the separation, the sky was empty. No moon, no sun, no stars. Only the vast open space between heaven and earth, filled with wind and the gray half-light of a world still learning how to be itself. The earth steamed where water evaporated. Stone cooled in the open air for the first time, and Enlil moved through all of it. He was not alone for long. From the body of the Earth Mother herself, another god emerged, quieter, slower, born not from the crack of separation, but from the deep places where groundwater still remembered the Primordial Sea. His name was Enki. And where Enlil was force, Enki was something entirely different. Enki was patient water. Not the wild water of flood and storm, but the clever water of underground springs. The kind that finds its way through cracks in stone, that rises silently into wells, that feeds the roots of growing things without being seen. He was born knowing things Enlil would never think to ask. The properties of clay, the nature of plants, the secret paths of fish. Where Enlil raged across the surface of the world, shaping it with power, Enki settled into the deep places and quietly understood it. He made his home in the Abzu, the same underground freshwater realm that had existed since before creation began. There, beneath the waters of the city that would be called Eridu, he built his temple and kept his counsel. The 2 brothers stood at opposite ends of every quality the universe possessed. Enlil was the fist, powerful, direct, commanding obedience through sheer force. Enki was the open hand, gentle, inventive, endlessly curious. Enlil ruled by decree. Enki ruled by understanding. Between these 2 natures, the great drama of the gods would unfold. For now, the world was new and bare. The sky stood open. The earth was drying beneath a tireless wind. And somewhere in the deep, Enki was already thinking about what might grow in all this space. What might be built, what might be created. What strange and fragile things might one day walk across the surface of the cooling ground. The silence of the world would not last. Even Enlil, who loved the stillness of empty plains and the quiet hum of wind through reeds, would soon find that silence, once broken, can never quite be restored. The universe had opened. Something would have to fill it. Chapter 4. Enlil and Ninlil, the transgression at the sacred river. In the holy city of Nippur, beside a canal of clear water, the king of the gods made a choice that even his own kind could not forgive. Nippur was the first among sacred cities. It sat at the center of the Sumerian world, not because it was the largest or the wealthiest, but because it was the city of Enlil, the place where the wind god had chosen to rest between his endless circuits of the sky. His great temple there was called the Eker, the mountain house. The Ekker's walls were said to reach from the foundations of the earth to the lower edge of heaven. Around it, the city grew in quiet order. Streets of packed earth ran between mud-brick houses. Reed fences enclosed small gardens where date palms grew beside shallow irrigation channels. The air smelled of baking grain and the faint mineral scent of canal water. Through the heart of Nippur ran a canal called the Idnunbirtum. Its waters were considered sacred, older than the city itself, fed by deep underground currents that remembered the primordial Abzu. No impurity was permitted to touch those waters. To bathe in them uninvited, to cast refuse into their flow, was an offense against the divine order itself. Priests walked along its banks at dawn and dusk, murmuring prayers to the water that flowed beneath their feet. The canal was not merely a channel of irrigation. It was a vein of the original creation running through the heart of the god's city, clear and cold and alive, with a holiness that predated every temple, every wall, every law that had been written. It was beside this canal, in the early days of the world when the gods still walked openly among the sacred places, that a young goddess named Ninlil lived with her mother, Nunbar-shegunu. Ninlil was beautiful in the way that spring is beautiful, not yet fully formed, still carrying the softness of something that has only recently come into bloom. Her mother knew the dangers of that beauty. Nunbar-shegunu had watched Enlil pass along the canal on his restless walks, the wind stirring the water in his wake, his gaze sweeping across everything with the casual authority of a god who owns the air itself. She warned her daughter plainly, "Stay away from the canal. Do not go near the water when Enlil walks." The warning was clear. The sacred canal was Enlil's path, and the wind god's appetites were as restless as his nature. But Ninlil was young, and the water was cool, and the day was warm, and the canal lay just beyond the garden wall. She went to the water's edge. She lingered. She looked at her own reflection in the clear surface and found it pleasing. She stepped into the canal. The sacred water closed around her ankles, then her knees. She waded deeper, letting the current press against her body, feeling the coolness rise along her skin. The canal was quiet. The city seemed far away. For a moment, there was nothing in the world but a young goddess standing in clear water beneath an open sky. Enlil found her there. The texts do not describe a long courtship. They do not describe tenderness or persuasion. The wind god saw what he wanted and reached for it. Ninlil refused him. She told him she was too young. She told him her lips did not yet know how to kiss. But Enlil was the king of the gods, and he was not accustomed to hearing the word no. What happened in the canal was not gentle. The Sumerian scribes who recorded this story did not disguise it or dress it in the language of romance. They wrote it as a transgression, a violation of something sacred. The holy water of the Idnunbirtum was defiled. Ninlil was taken against her will, and from that act a child was conceived who would change the darkness of the world forever. The child growing inside Ninlil was Nanna, the moon, the first light that would ever shine in the night sky. Cold and silver and round, born from an act of force in sacred water. The Sumerians seemed to understand that beautiful things can come from terrible beginnings. They did not excuse what Enlil had done. They simply recorded the consequence, and the consequence was luminous. But the gods were watching, the Anunnaki, the great assembly of divine beings who governed the laws of heaven and earth, had seen what Enlil had done in the sacred canal. They were not moved by his power. They were not intimidated by his title. 50 great gods gathered in council, and 7 among them who held the authority to determine destiny sat in judgment. The verdict was unanimous. Enlil, king of the gods, Lord of the Wind, the first mover of the universe, was guilty. He had violated the sacred waters. He had taken by force what was not offered. Even the mightiest of gods was not above the law. The sentence was exile, banishment to the underworld, to the dark land called Kur, from which no light escapes. Enlil did not fight the judgment. Perhaps he could have. His power was greater than any god's. But the law of the Anunnaki was the only thing in the universe that Enlil himself had helped to build, and to break it would be to break the order that gave his own authority meaning. He accepted the sentence. He turned his back on the bright world he had made. The wind left Nippur that day. The air grew still. The trees stood motionless in their gardens. The surface of the Idnunbirtum became flat and reflective as polished bronze, undisturbed by even the smallest ripple. The god who had given the world its first motion was walking downward, away from the sky, into the silent passages beneath the earth. And behind him, at a distance, carrying the first moon in her womb, Ninlil followed. No one had asked her to. No one had commanded it. She simply went. Whatever had happened in the canal, whatever she felt about the god who had wronged her, she chose to follow him into the dark. The reasons belonged to her, and the old texts do not presume to explain them. Chapter 5. The Underworld Disguises. In the land beneath the earth, where no light falls and no wind blows, Enlil found that even exile could be turned to purpose. The road to the underworld was not a road at all. It was a descent, a slow passage through layers of stone and packed earth, through places where the air grew heavy and the temperature dropped, and the last memory of sunlight faded behind you like a voice calling from a shore you could no longer see. The Sumerians called this place Kur. Enlil walked it without looking back. His wind, which had once filled the entire space between heaven and earth, was muted here. The passages of the underworld were narrow and close. There was no sky to fill, no plains to sweep across. The air hung motionless, thick with the smell of damp stone and the faint metallic taste of deep groundwater. Behind him, at a distance, she maintained like a shadow keeping pace. With a traveler, Ninlil followed. Her belly was beginning to round with the weight of the moonchild growing inside her. She moved carefully through the dark passages, one hand on the stone wall, feeling her way downward into a world she had never imagined she would visit. The underworld had its own geography. There were gates, heavy doors of bronze and stone, each attended by a keeper. There were rivers that ran without current, dark water that reflected nothing. There were vast open chambers, where the spirits of the dead sat in dust and silence, eating clay, drinking shadow, remembering nothing of the sunlit world above. Enlil arrived at the first gate, and there, something shifted in him. Perhaps it was the restlessness that was his fundamental nature, the inability to simply accept a condition, to sit still in a place and let time pass. Perhaps it was ambition, or perhaps it was something more calculated. Enlil looked at the underworld and saw not punishment but opportunity. The keeper of the first gate was a minor god whose only duty was to stand beside the heavy door and admit those who had been sent below. Enlil approached this keeper, but when he arrived, he was no longer wearing his own form. He had taken the shape and voice of the gatekeeper, a disguise so complete that even a god might be deceived. When Ninlil reached the gate, she asked the figure standing there if he had seen Enlil pass through. The disguised god told her nothing. Instead, he spoke to her with a voice that was not quite Enlil's and not quite a stranger's, and in the dim light of the underworld passage, in the confusion of exile and loneliness, and the ache of carrying a divine child, Ninlil lay with him. From that encounter, a second child was conceived. This one would not rise into the sky. This child was Nergal, a god of the underworld itself, of war and pestilence, and the governance of the dead. Where Nanna would be silver light in darkness, Nergal would be the darkness that silver light cannot reach. A necessary god. A terrible one. Ninlil continued deeper into the underworld, still searching for the true face of her husband. She came to a river, one of the dark, motionless waterways that threaded through the land beneath the earth. Standing beside it was a figure who called himself the Man of the River. He spoke to her. He asked where she was going. He offered comfort in a voice that almost sounded familiar. Again, it was Enlil in disguise. Again, Ninlil lay with him beside the dark water, in a place where the sound of the surface world could not reach, and the only light was the faint phosphorescence of minerals in the wet stone walls. From this second encounter, a third child was conceived, Ninazu, god of healing and the boundary between the living and the dead. The pattern held one final time. Deeper still in the underworld, where the last passages narrowed to a point, beyond which even gods hesitated to travel, Ninlil encountered a ferryman. He stood beside a small boat on the shore of the final river, the boundary beyond which lay the deepest chambers of Kur, where nothing stirred and nothing changed. The ferryman was Enlil. His third disguise, his final deception. Ninlil, perhaps knowing by now, perhaps choosing not to know, lay with him once more on the shore of that last river. The child conceived from this encounter was Enbilulu, god of canals and irrigation, the deity who would one day govern the flow of water across the surface of the earth. 4 children then. 4 gods born from one exile, Nanna the moon, conceived in sacred water above. Nergal, Ninazu, and Enbilulu conceived in the passages of the underworld below. Through them, Enlil had accomplished something extraordinary. He had extended his lineage, and through it his influence, into the one realm that had been beyond his reach. The underworld now held his children. This was not merely a story about desire or deception. The Sumerians understood it as something larger. Before Enlil's exile, the underworld was ungoverned, a place of dust and forgetting, without structure, without authority, without purpose. After his journey, it had rulers. It had a god of death, a god of boundaries, a god of passage. The land of the dead had been organized, and above the world, something new had appeared. Nanna, the moon-child born from the waters of the sacred canal, rose into the jasper dome of the sky and began his slow, cold circuit. For the first time since the separation of heaven and earth, the darkness of night was not absolute. A pale silver light fell across the sleeping world, turning rivers into mirrors. Enlil's sentence was eventually lifted. The texts do not say precisely when, or what rite of purification was performed. But the wind returned to the surface of the earth. The trees in Nippur's gardens bent again beneath moving air. The Id Nunbir Tum rippled with small waves. The god of storms was coming home. He resumed his restless patrol of the world he had made, and Ninlil walked beside him now. No longer the girl at the canal, but a goddess who had followed her husband into the realm of the dead and come back changed. She had borne 4 gods. She had seen the underworld. She feared very little now. The world was fuller now than it had ever been. It had a sky with 3 layers, an earth with mountains and rivers, an underworld with governance and law. It had wind and moonlight, and the faint beginnings of an order that the gods could build upon. The structure of the cosmos was nearly complete, but it was still empty of the one thing that would matter most. There were no small, fragile creatures yet to tend the gods' temples and plow their fields. No voices rising from cities not yet built. No hands to press, read into clay, and record the names of the gods who shaped the world. That creation was still to come. and it would begin with a god sitting quietly in his underwater temple, turning an idea like a potter turns clay. Chapter 6. Enki and the Ordering of the World. While the wind god ruled the earth by force, the water god shaped it by design, assigning every river its course, every craft its guardian, every god its purpose. Eridu was the oldest city. Not the largest, not the most powerful, but the first. The place where the Sumerians believed civilization itself had begun. It sat at the edge of the southern marshes, where the Euphrates dissolved into a labyrinth of reed beds and shallow lagoons. The air there was thick, with the smell of wet earth and slow water. Beneath Eridu, in the cool darkness below the water table, Enki had built his temple. The Abzu, the house of the deep water, was fashioned of silver and adorned with lapis lazuli. Its foundation sank into the living rock of the underground aquifer. Sacred water flowed through channels in its floor, and in its deepest chambers, that flowing was the only sound. This was Enki's seat of power, not a throne room of gold and storm like Enlil's Eker, but a place of running water and quiet work. Enki did not rule by command, he ruled by arrangement. He looked at the raw, newly formed world and asked not how to dominate it, but how to make it function. The task was enormous. Mountains had risen. Rivers had carved their first paths through soft ground, but nothing was organized. There were no seasons, no cycles of growth and harvest. The world was like a workshop with every tool scattered on the floor, full of potential but empty of order. Someone had to arrange the pieces. Enki began with water. He filled the Tigris and the Euphrates with sweet, life-giving current. In the old poems, the rivers were described as flowing from his very shoulders, two streams of abundance pouring from the body of the god himself. Where the water reached, the soil darkened and softened. Where it pooled, reeds and grasses began to grow. He assigned a god to the plow and a god to the furrow. He gave the brick mold its guardian and the kiln its keeper. He established the boundaries of fields and the rules of irrigation, which canal should flow where, which gate should open when, which season belonged to planting and which to harvest. Every function received a divine custodian. The art of weaving was placed in the care of a goddess. Metalwork was entrusted to a god of the forge. Herds of cattle and flocks of sheep were assigned divine shepherds who would ensure that breeding followed the rhythms of the year. Even the wild animals of the steppe received their overseers, gods who watched the movements of gazelle and fish. Writing was among Enki's most valued gifts to the world. The art of pressing a reed stylus into wet clay, of recording debts and laws and stories, of preserving knowledge beyond the reach of a single memory. This was a craft he placed above nearly all others. Knowledge, he understood, grew stronger the more widely it was shared. All these assignments were governed by the me, a word pronounced like the English word may. The me were the divine decrees that held civilization together. There were more than 100. Kingship was a me. Priesthood was a me. Music, truth, carpentry, the art of lamentation, the power to descend to the underworld and return. Each of these was a me. Enki kept the me in his temple at Eridu, guarded like treasures in a vault of flowing water. They were not objects exactly, not tablets or jewels, though they were sometimes described that way. They were principles made tangible. The laws of civilized existence given weight and form, stored in the oldest temple beneath the waters of the Abzu. To visit the Abzu was to enter a world unlike any other temple in creation. Where other gods built their sanctuaries from sun-dried brick and towering mud-brick walls, Enki's temple hummed with the sound of moving water. Fish carved from stone guarded its doorways. Turtles of polished lapis lazuli rested on its ledges. The air inside was cool and damp, and every surface gleamed. Priests who served there learned the arts of incantation and divination. They poured libations of water into sacred pools that mirrored the Abzu below, and they whispered prayers to clay figurines shaped in the likeness of the god himself. Eridu was not merely a city with a temple. It was the place where knowledge lived, where wisdom had a physical address and running water for a voice. With the Emmy in place, the world began to function. Rivers flowed on schedule. Rains came when needed. Barley grew in the fields beside the canals. Date palms bore fruit in the gardens of the first cities. Fish swam in the marshes. Sheep multiplied on the low hills. The machinery of creation was turning, and Enki watched from his silver temple with quiet satisfaction. But not every god was satisfied. Among the assembly, one voice rose in complaint. Inanna, goddess of love and war, of the morning and evening star, of beauty and ambition, looked at what Enki had distributed and felt she had been given too little. Her domains were powerful but narrow. She wanted more. She would remember this slight. Enki tried to placate her. He pointed to the spheres she already possessed. The power over hearts, the authority of desire, the sway she held over the passions of gods and mortals alike. But Inanna was the youngest of the great goddesses and the hungriest. In time, she would find a way to take what she believed she deserved. That reckoning lay in the future. For now, the world was ordered. The gods had their duties. The rivers had their courses. The Me governed every craft and law. Enki had done what Enlil alone could never have done. He had turned raw force into functioning civilization. The wind had made the space. The water had filled it with purpose. But someone had to maintain all this order. Someone had to dig the canals and tend the fields and haul the stone and bake the bread. In this young world where humanity had not yet been imagined, that burden fell entirely on the gods themselves. The younger gods, the lesser gods, the ones whose names would never appear above a temple door. Chapter 7. The Burden of the Lesser Gods. For thousands of years, the younger gods labored in the fields and canals of the world they had been given, until the weight of that labor became more than even immortal shoulders could bear. The great gods did not dig. Enlil did not bend his back over a canal bed. Enki did not carry baskets of wet earth on his shoulders. Anu, high in the outermost heaven, did not trouble himself with irrigation ditches. The work of maintaining the world fell to the younger generation, the Igigi, the minor Anunnaki, the divine laborers, whose power was real but whose rank was low. They dug the riverbeds. This was their first and greatest task. Carving the Tigris and the Euphrates into proper channels, cutting through miles of clay and stone and packed sediment to give the water a path from mountains to sea. They worked with tools of divine substance, harder than any metal the earth contained, and still the labor was crushing. The canals came next. Thousands of them, branching from the main rivers, carrying water to every field and garden that the gods had planned. Each canal had to be dug by hand, its banks packed, its gates fitted. And when the canals silted up, as canals always do, they had to be dredged and cleared and rebuilt from the bottom upward. The fields required constant attention: plowing, planting, watering, weeding, harvesting. The cycle turned without pause. When one season's crop was gathered, the next season's preparation began immediately. The soil had to be turned. The seed had to be sorted. The irrigation had to be maintained with precision, or the crops would fail and the upper gods would go without offerings. Everything the younger gods grew was offered upward, to Enli, to Enki, to Anu, to the great Anunnaki who sat in their temples and received the fruits of labor they had never performed. Fresh bread, ripe dates, cold beer, roasted meat, fine linen. All of it flowed from the hands of workers to the tables of rulers. The arrangement was absolute. Beyond the fields, there were other burdens. The younger gods forged tools and hammered copper into bowls and blades for the higher deities. They wove garments of fine thread. They shaped jewelry from gold and carnelian to adorn the thrones and altars of their masters. Every beautiful thing in the divine world was made by hands that ached from the making. And when the work was done, though it was never truly done, there was no rest. Only the brief pause between one task and the next, a moment of stillness in which a lesser god might lean against a canal wall and look up at the sky he had never been permitted to inhabit, before the next order came down from above. The Atrahasis text says the lesser gods endured this for 3,600 years. Whether that number was meant literally, or as a way of saying an incomprehensibly long time, the meaning was clear. The labor had no end. The gods who performed it had no rest. And they were immortal, which meant the sentence stretched before them without horizon. Imagine being unable to die and unable to stop working. Imagine digging the same canal for centuries, watching it fill with silt, digging it again. Hauling baskets of earth up a slope under a sun that never sets on your labor, knowing that tomorrow will be the same, and the century after, and the millennium after that. The resentment built slowly. Not a sudden eruption, but a gradual hardening. A bitterness that accumulated the way silt gathers in a canal, layer by layer, until the channel can no longer carry water. The younger gods muttered among themselves. They looked at the temples where their superiors rested and wondered why the arrangement could not be different. The breaking point came in the darkness. One night, the lesser gods gathered together. They burned their tools, they set fire to their baskets and digging implements, and then, in a mass that looked like an army marching to war, they walked toward the Ekur. Enlil's temple, the mountain house, the seat of divine authority in Nippur. They surrounded it. Their voices rose in a roar that even the wind god could not drown out. They did not storm the gates. They did not attack. They simply stood, hundreds of them, torchlight flickering on their exhausted faces, and demanded that the order be changed. They would not dig another canal. They would not plow another furrow. Enlil was shaken from his sleep. The king of the gods, mightiest force in creation, was genuinely alarmed by the sight of his own workers standing in mutiny outside his walls. He sent for his advisors. He sent for the council. The crisis was unprecedented. Nothing in the ordered universe had prepared the great gods for the possibility that the lesser ones might simply refuse. It was Enki who answered. Quiet, patient Enki, who had perhaps been anticipating this moment in his temple beneath the waters of Eridu. He came to the divine council with a proposal. The lesser gods were right to be tired. Their labor was unsustainable. But instead of punishing them, Enki suggested something no god had ever imagined before. Create something new. A creature fashioned from the substance of the earth, animated by something divine, capable of performing every task the gods found burdensome. A being that could dig and plow and build, that could bake bread and brew beer, that could serve the gods faithfully and free the divine laborers from their endless toil. The council listened. Enlil considered. The idea had an elegance that even the wind god could appreciate. It solved the problem cleanly. But there was a cost. To give this new creature intelligence and strength, divine substance would be required. Not just clay and water. Something carrying the spark of awareness. A god would have to be sacrificed. One god's blood would become the blueprint. The lesser gods lowered their torches and stepped back from the walls of the Ekur. The crisis had passed. Something unprecedented was about to happen. A creation that would change the balance between maker and made forever. And somewhere in the darkness outside Nippur, the last quiet night of a world without human beings was slowly drawing to its close. Chapter 8. The Creation of Humanity. From the blood of a willing God and the clay of the deep earth, the first human beings opened their eyes, fragile, purposeful, and alive. The council had spoken. A new creature would be made, something capable of bearing the labor that the younger gods could no longer endure. But Enki, the architect of this creation, knew that clay alone would not suffice. Earth could give form, and water could give moisture, but neither could give thought. For that, something divine was required. Among the assembled gods, one came forward. His name was Geshtu-e, sometimes written as We-Ilu in later texts. He was not one of the great gods. He held no throne, governed no river, commanded no storm. But the ancient texts describe him with a phrase that sets him apart from every other deity in the story. He was called a god who has sense. What that meant, precisely, the scribes did not explain. Perhaps it meant he was wise. Perhaps it meant he was the one who understood, better than any other, what the creation of humanity would require and what it would cost. Whatever the reason, Geshtu-e offered himself willingly. He stepped forward from the assembly and knelt beside the altar where the birth goddess waited. The killing was solemn. It was not done in anger or haste. The gods watched as Geshtu-e's blood, bright with the spark of divine intelligence, was collected in vessels of sacred clay. This was not merely a liquid. It was a blueprint. It carried within it the capacity for thought, for memory, for the restless awareness that would define every human being who ever lived. Enki carried the blood to the place of making. There, in a space prepared with ritual care, the birth goddess Nintu waited. She was also called Mami, and in some traditions Ninhursag, the Lady of the Mountain, the Great Mother, the one whose hands had shaped more living things than any other god. Her fingers were said to be the most delicate instruments in all of creation. The clay had been gathered from the deep places, red earth drawn up from beneath the Abzu, rich with mineral and memory. It was not ordinary soil. It carried the residue of the oldest generations, the sediment of Lamu and Lahamu, the primal matter that had existed since the first stirring in the dark. Enki mixed this clay with the blood of Geshtu-e and the water of life. Nintu took the mixture into her hands. She worked it with the precision of a sculptor and the tenderness of a mother. From the blended substance, she pinched 14 pieces, 7 for the left side, 7 for the right. The left would become male. The right would become female. Each piece was shaped with exacting care, each one slightly different from the others. She placed each piece into a vessel of warmth, a kind of divine womb, where the clay and blood and water would slowly fuse into something that had never existed before. The vessels were tended by the birth goddess herself. No other hand touched them. No other eye watched the slow transformation happening within. 10 months passed, the same span the Sumerians observed for human pregnancy. The vessels were tended. The birth goddess watched over them, and when the time was complete, 14 small figures emerged, blinking, breathing, warm with life, their skin the color of the red clay from which they had been made. 7 men, 7 women, the first human beings. They were not gods. They were smaller, softer, more fragile in every way. Their bones would break, their skin would bruise, their breath, unlike the breath of gods, would one day cease. But they could think. They could learn. They could hold a tool in their hands and understand what it was for. The blood of Geshtu-e had given them that much. Enki, watching from the edge of the making place, was pleased. But he was also curious. perhaps too curious. He looked at the remaining clay, the scraps left over from Nintu's careful work, and he could not resist the urge to try his own hand at creation. He was, after all, the god of making things. Surely his fingers could shape life as well as hers. He took 2 pieces of the leftover clay and fashioned them into figures. They were rougher than Nintu's work, less carefully proportioned, less precisely formed. He placed them alongside the others, in the vessels of warmth, and waited. When they emerged, the difference was visible at once. One lacked vitality, slow, unfocused, unable to hold itself upright without help. The other was formed with the characteristics of both male and female, its body uncertain of its own design. These were not the careful work of the birth goddess. They were the experiments of a god who had overestimated his skill. Nintu saw what Enki had done, and her anger was immediate. She had warned him. Creation required not just intelligence but delicacy, the patient, exacting touch of one who understood the sacred geometry of a living body. Enki's cleverness had overreached. His pride in his own abilities had produced beings who would struggle in ways the others would not. The birth goddess spoke her curse aloud. Because Enki had meddled with forces that required her authority, humanity would forever carry the mark of his carelessness. In every generation, there would be children born with bodies that did not function as expected, or with forms that blurred the boundaries others took for granted. This was not cruelty, it was consequence. But the curse carried within it a second clause, and this one was directed at Enki himself. These children, Nintu declared, would be his responsibility. He was the god of wisdom, the god of solutions. It would fall to him, and to the knowledge he gave humanity, to find ways for every person, regardless of how they were made, to live within the community of their kind. Enki accepted. He did not argue or protest. He knew that the birth goddess was right, that his eagerness had overstepped the boundary of his skill. And so, from the very beginning of human existence, the duty of care was woven into the fabric of creation. Wisdom existed not to serve the strong alone, but to shelter those the world had made differently. Nintu breathed life into all 16 beings. She gave them the power to bear children, to multiply and fill the earth the gods had prepared. The first humans stood in the light of the world, small and bewildered and alive, looking up at the sky with eyes that had never seen anything before. The gods looked back with expressions ranging from satisfaction to something close to unease. The world had its workers now. The canals would be dug, the fields would be plowed, the gods would be fed and clothed and praised. But something had shifted in the balance of creation. Something subtle. Something none of the gods fully understood. A new kind of being had entered the story, and stories, once they acquire new characters, have a way of going where no one planned. Chapter 9. The Age of Service and the Growing Noise. The first humans were obedient, industrious, and fruitful. So fruitful that their voices would one day reach the ears of a sleeping god and change everything. The first generations did exactly what they were made to do. They took the tools from the hands of the exhausted lesser gods and bent their backs to the earth. They dug canals. They plowed furrows in the dark soil. They planted barley and emmer wheat in straight rows along the irrigation channels, and waited for the green shoots to push through the crust of the field. They learned quickly. Enki, true to his nature, did not simply set humanity to work and walk away. He showed them how to read the movement of water through soil, how to time the planting to the rhythm of the river's rise and fall. He gave them the reed stylus and the clay tablet, the first writing, the first permanent memory outside a living mind. Other gods contributed their gifts. The goddess of grain showed humanity how to harvest and thresh and store. The god of the forge taught them to heat copper until it softened, to pour it into molds of fired clay, to shape it into tools and ornaments. The god of the loom showed them how to spin thread from wool and weave it into cloth against the cold. Within a few generations, the humans had become remarkably capable. They built houses of mud brick, sturdy and square, with reed roofs that kept out the rain. They dug wells that reached down to the sweet water of the Abzu. They baked bread in clay ovens and brewed beer from fermented barley, a thick, nourishing drink that they shared with the gods in daily offerings. The temples rose first. Before the humans built palaces or marketplaces, they built houses for the gods. Tall structures of mud brick and plaster, painted white, with wide courtyards where offerings could be laid out on reed mats. Every morning, the humans set fresh bread and dates and beer before the statues of their makers. Every evening, they sang hymns in a language the gods had taught them. The gods were pleased. The arrangement worked. The lesser gods, freed at last from the crushing weight of manual labor, could rest. The greater gods received their offerings without interruption. Enlil could sleep. Enki could think. Anu, in his distant heaven, received the scent of burning incense and was satisfied. For a time, for a long, peaceful time, the world was in balance. The Atrahasis text tells us this harmony lasted 1,200 years. Whether that span was literal or symbolic, it represented an age of quiet prosperity, a golden era in which humanity served and the gods were served, and neither side found cause for complaint. The canals flowed, the fields yielded, the temples filled with the sweet smoke of offerings. But humanity had been made with one quality that the gods had not fully anticipated. They were fertile, enormously, relentlessly fertile. The blood of Geshtu-e and the water of life had given them a capacity for reproduction that far exceeded anything the divine world had planned for. Each generation was larger than the last. Each city grew. Each field required more hands, which produced more mouths, which required more fields. The noise began gradually. It was not any single sound, but the accumulated hum of thousands upon thousands of human lives being lived at once. The clang of hammers, the shouts of market vendors, the crying of infants, the songs of workers in the fields, the prayers chanted in 100 temples at once. It rose from the earth like heat from a kiln, constant and inescapable. For most of the gods, this noise was simply the sound of a functioning world. But for Enlil, the god of air and storm, whose very nature was attuned to every vibration in the atmosphere, the noise was unbearable. It pressed against his consciousness the way a headache presses against the inside of a skull. It invaded his sleep, which was deep and long and sacred to him. The wind god woke in fury. His eyes, the texts say, were red with irritation. The air around his temple trembled with the force of his displeasure. He looked down at the earth he had made and saw it crawling with tiny, busy, noisy creatures. Millions of them now, spreading across the land like ants across a dropped piece of fruit. And he decided that something had to be done. He summoned the Anunnaki. The great assembly of the gods gathered in the divine council chamber, and Enlil stood before them with the tablet of destinies glowing upon his throne. This tablet was the supreme instrument of divine authority. Whatever was inscribed upon it became the law of the universe. No god could overrule it. No force could undo what it decreed. Enlil's voice filled the chamber like a storm filling a valley. He spoke of the noise. He spoke of his ruined sleep. He spoke of a creation that had multiplied beyond reason, that had turned the quiet earth into a marketplace of endless clamor. Then he inscribed his judgment on the tablet of destinies, in characters that burned brighter than the sun. Humanity, the tablet declared, would be destroyed. The creatures that had been made to serve the gods had become a burden greater than the burden they had been created to relieve. The noise would end. The earth would be silent again. And the gods, for the first time since the rebellion of the lesser deities, would have to decide what mattered more, their comfort or their creation. The judgment was made. The council was dismissed. And somewhere in a reed-walled temple by the river, a quiet god named Enki sat in the dark and stared at the water flowing through his temple floor, turning a terrible problem over in his mind. He had given these creatures their intelligence, their curiosity, their capacity for wonder. And now the mightiest god in creation had decreed their end. Chapter 10. 3 Catastrophes. 3 times the gods sent ruin upon the earth. 3 times the humans nearly perished, and 3 times a voice in the dark showed them the way through. The first disaster came as hunger. Not the ordinary hunger of a bad harvest, but a systematic starvation, a withdrawal of the earth's willingness to feed the things that lived upon it. Enlil had spoken, and the tablet of destinies had recorded his will. The gods of rain and grain obeyed. Adad, the storm god, sealed the clouds and refused to let them open. The rain stopped. At first, the humans barely noticed. The irrigation canals still carried water from the rivers, and the stored grain in the temple granaries lasted through the first dry months. But as the weeks stretched into seasons and the seasons into years, the soil began to change. It whitened. Salt crept upward from the deep earth, crusting the surface of the fields like frost on a winter morning. The barley withered. The emmer wheat curled and dried in rows that had once been green. Date palms dropped their unripe fruit, and the fruit lay on the cracked earth, blackening in the heat. The canals still flowed, but the water they carried could not undo what the salt had done. The fields were poisoned from below, and no amount of surface water could wash the poison away. Hunger spread through the human settlements like a slow tide. Granaries emptied. Children cried at night, and their mothers had nothing to give them. The offerings that had once filled the temple courtyards grew thin. A handful of grain where there had been baskets, a cup of thin beer where there had been jars. The gods in their temples noticed the change and shifted uncomfortably. In the midst of this dying, one man heard a voice. His name was Atrahasis, a word that means exceedingly wise. He was not a king, though some traditions place him in a royal line. He was a man who listened, a man who paid attention to the silences between the sounds, to the currents beneath the surface, to the messages that arrived in dreams and whispered prayers. The voice belonged to Enki. The water god could not openly defy Enlil's decree. The tablet of destinies was absolute. But Enki was clever. He did not speak to Atrahasis as a god speaks to a mortal. He spoke through the water beneath the man's house, through the sound of the spring that fed his well, through the quiet murmur of underground currents only a listening ear could catch. Enki told Atrahasis how to appease the specific god who had brought the famine. Worship him, make offerings to him alone, turn the attention of the people toward the deity responsible, and that god, flattered and softened, might relent. Atrahasis followed the instructions. The people prayed, and slowly, grudgingly, the rains returned. The salt receded, the fields recovered, humanity survived. 1,200 years passed. The humans multiplied again. The noise returned, louder than before, rising from cities that had grown larger and more numerous in the centuries of peace. Enlil woke once more, his rest shattered by the hum of human existence, and once more he turned to the divine council with fury in his voice. This time, the punishment was drought, not merely the absence of rain, but the closing of every water source the earth possessed. The underground springs were sealed. The rivers shrank to muddy trickles. The wells that humans had dug with such care and effort stood dry, their stone walls sweating with a moisture that never gathered into drops. The world baked under a merciless sky. The suffering was worse than the famine. Thirst is a crueler master than hunger. Animals died first, cattle in the fields, sheep on the hillsides, their bodies bloating in the heat. Then the old and the young began to fall. Dust filled the air where water had once flowed, and the temples stood empty because the people had nothing left to offer. Again, Enki found a way. Through whispered guidance, through dreams sent to Atrahasis in the darkest hours of the night, the water god showed his faithful servant where to dig. Deeper than any well had gone before, down to the last hidden veins of moisture that even Enlil's decree had not reached. A remnant of humanity survived, huddled around wells, sunk deep into the suffering earth. Another 1,200 years, another recovery, another flourishing of human life across the land, with all its noise and energy and ceaseless, restless activity. And again, Enlil's eyes opened in the dark, red with irritation, and again the divine council was summoned to hear the wind god's displeasure. The third catastrophe was plague. Disease moved through the human settlements like shadow through a corridor, silent, invisible, touching one house and sparing the next with no pattern anyone could discern. The death god Namtar walked among the living, selecting his victims with a hand that left no mark. Fever came first, then weakness, then the stillness that no prayer could reverse. The dying was quiet this time. No dramatic collapse, no visible ruin of field or river. Just a slow subtraction of human life from the world, bed by bed, house by house, until the streets of the cities grew empty, and the temples fell silent not from drought or hunger, but from the simple absence of people to fill them. Enki's guidance came once more. He taught Atrahasis the properties of certain plants, which roots could reduce fever, which leaves could ease pain, which combinations could strengthen a body against the invisible hand of disease. The wise man gathered these remedies. He gathered clay tablets inscribed with every piece of knowledge humanity had accumulated. And with a small remnant, he endured. 3 times destroyed, 3 times saved. And Enlil, watching from above, knew that someone among the gods was betraying his decrees. The wind god's fury was no longer merely annoyance at noise. It had become something colder, a determination to end humanity not gradually, not partially, but completely, in a single overwhelming act that no clever god could circumvent. Chapter 11. The Oath and the Great Flood. Enlil bound every god by oath. No divine mouth would warn the humans of what was coming. But Enki, the cleverest of them all, found a way to speak without speaking. The fourth council was different from the others. Enlil did not merely announce a punishment and assign a god to carry it out. He stood before the assembled Anunnaki, with the tablet of destinies held before him, its surface blazing with a light that made even the greatest gods lower their eyes. And he demanded something that had never been demanded before. An oath. Every god, without exception, would swear on the tablet of destinies that no divine being would warn humanity of the coming destruction. No whispered advice, no dreams sent to sleeping men, no messages carried by wind or water or the flight of birds. The humans would face what was coming, with no foreknowledge and no protection. This time, the end would be final. The gods swore. One by one, they placed their hands upon the tablet and spoke the words of binding. Even those who had watched humanity with fondness, the goddess of love, the sun god who saw everything from his path across the sky, even they swore. The oath of the tablet of destinies could not be broken. To defy it was to defy the structure of existence itself. Enki swore too. He had no choice. To refuse would be to declare himself an enemy of the divine order, and even the God of wisdom could not survive that. He spoke the words. He placed his hand on the burning tablet, and he meant what he said. He would not speak to any human being about what the gods had planned. But Enki was the god of cleverness, and cleverness is the art of solving problems within constraints rather than by breaking them. He had sworn not to speak to a human being. He had not sworn to remain silent in the presence of objects that a human being might happen to be near. The distinction was narrow. The distinction was everything. That night, in the city where Atrahasis lived, the wise man was sleeping in his house of reed and clay. The walls of the house were thin, woven reeds plastered with mud, the standard construction of a Mesopotamian dwelling. The sound of water could be heard through them, as it always could in a city built beside a canal. Enki came to that house. He did not enter it. He did not wake the man sleeping inside. Instead, he pressed his mouth close to the outer wall, to the bundled reeds, the dried mud, the thin barrier between the divine world and the human one, and he spoke. Not to Atrahasis, to the wall. Wall, listen to me. Reed hut, remember my words. The god of wisdom spoke to the architecture. He told the wall about a flood unlike any natural disaster, a flood sent by the combined will of every god in creation, a flood that would cover the mountains and drown every living thing that walked or crawled or flew upon the earth. He told the wall how to build a boat. He described its dimensions, its height, its breadth, the number of its levels. He specified the materials. Light wood for the frame, woven reed for the hull, hot bitumen. The thick, black, tar-like substance that seeped naturally from the ground in Mesopotamia, to seal every seam and joint against the intrusion of water. Atrahasis lay in the dark and listened. Whether he understood the subtlety of what Enki was doing, speaking to a wall so that a man might overhear, or whether he simply absorbed the message as a dreamer absorbs a vision, the texts do not say. What matters is that he heard. And when morning came, he knew exactly what he had to do. The construction began immediately. Atrahasis gathered every carpenter, every builder, every craftsman he could find. The boat rose from the riverbank in sections, a massive vessel, far larger than anything that had ever floated on a Mesopotamian waterway. 7 levels, each divided into 9 compartments. The frame was sturdy wood. The hull was sealed with pitch until it gleamed black in the sun. 7 days. That was how long the building took, according to the texts. Whether the number was literal or symbolic, the point was urgency. Atrahasis worked without rest. He drove his builders forward with the desperate energy of a man who has heard the unthinkable and chosen to believe it. Around him, the neighbors watched with puzzled curiosity, not understanding why anyone would build a boat of such absurd proportions. Some laughed. Some shook their heads and went back to their fields. The sky was clear. The rivers ran calmly in their channels. There was no sign of any danger that a reasonable person could point to and name. Only Atrahasis knew what was coming, and he could not explain how he knew without revealing the source of his knowledge. A god who had spoken to a wall. When the vessel was complete, Atrahasis began to load it. His family first, wife, children, those closest to him. Then the craftsmen who carried essential knowledge in their hands. Then animals, cattle, sheep, goats, birds, everything gathered from the fields and marshes. Grain and seed for planting. And the clay tablets, the irreplaceable records of everything humanity had learned. The last items were carried aboard as the first wind began to blow. It was a small wind, barely noticeable, the kind that stirs the tops of reeds and makes the surface of a canal wrinkle slightly. But it grew. Within hours, It had become a howl. The sky turned the color of iron, and the air smelled of wet stone and something far older than rain. The door of the boat was sealed with pitch. Inside, in the darkness, Atrahasis and his people listened to the wind and felt the floor beneath them begin, almost imperceptibly, to shift. Outside, the first drops of rain were falling, enormous drops, warm as blood, striking the dry earth like stones thrown against a drum. The great flood was beginning. Chapter 12. The waters above and below. For 7 days the world drowned, and in the sky above the water, the gods who had sent the flood huddled together like frightened animals, regretting what they had done. The rain did not fall the way ordinary rain falls. It came down in solid curtains walls, of water descending from a sky that had cracked open along seams no one knew existed. The floodgates of heaven, the text said, had been torn loose, and from below, from the sealed springs and underground rivers that Enki had once governed, water surged upward through every crack in the ground. The two sources met in the middle, rain from above and groundwater from below, merging across the surface of the earth like two hands closing around a small and fragile thing. Within a single day, the low-lying fields were underwater. The canals vanished beneath a rising sheet of brown water that carried mud and reeds, and the bodies of animals too slow to flee. By the second day, the water had reached the walls of the cities. Mud brick dissolves in water. The houses that humans had built with such care softened and collapsed, slumping into the flood like figures made of sand. The temples held longer. Their walls were thicker, but even they could not stand against a tide that had no intention of stopping. On the third day, the low hills disappeared. The sheep that had scrambled to higher ground stood in tightening clusters on shrinking islands of mud, bleeding into the rain. One by one, the islands went under. The sheep went silent. The sound of the flood, that endless, rushing, roaring sound, became the only voice left in the world. By the seventh day, even the mountains were gone. The highest peaks, the ones that had risen from Ki's body, when Enlil first separated heaven from earth, slipped beneath the surface like stones dropped into a well. The entire world was water. An unbroken sheet of gray-brown flood stretched from horizon to horizon, and the rain continued to fall on water that had nowhere left to go. Above this devastation, the gods retreated to the highest heaven, to Anu's outermost shell of Luludanitu stone, the one place the water could not reach. They gathered there in a tight, uncomfortable crowd, pressed together like stray dogs, sheltering from a storm they themselves had caused. The great assembly of the Anunnaki, rulers of the universe, sat in the dark and trembled. They were hungry. This was the detail that the ancient scribes recorded with something close to bitter humor. The gods who had destroyed humanity were now discovering what it felt like to go without the offerings that humanity had provided. No bread, no beer, no roasted meat, no sweet smoke of incense rising from the temple courtyards. The gods' stomachs growled in the dark. Ishtar wept. The goddess of love and war, who had sworn the oath and agreed to the flood, now looked down at the water-covered earth and mourned. She cried for the humans she had helped to nurture, the lovers and fighters, the singers and builders, the mothers and children who had filled the world with the very noise that Enlil found so unbearable. She was not the only one who grieved. The younger gods, the ones who had labored in the fields before humanity was created, remembered what that labor felt like. With no humans to do the work, the burden would fall back on their shoulders. The prospect of returning to the endless digging and hauling was almost as terrible as the flood itself. Even those gods who had eagerly supported the destruction now felt the absence. The world below them was not merely quiet, it was void. The intricate web of temples and cities and farmland, the morning hymns and evening offerings, the whole elaborate machinery of civilization, all of it was underwater. And the gods, for the first time, understood what they had erased. The rain stopped on the seventh day, slowly, grudgingly, as though the sky itself was exhausted by the effort. The clouds thinned. A pale, watery light broke through, falling on a surface of water that stretched in every direction without a single feature to break its terrible flatness. The world was gone. Everything the gods had built and the humans had maintained had been erased. Inside the boat, the survivors had counted the days by the rhythm of prayers. 7 days of darkness, of rocking, of the muffled roar of water against sealed wood. The animals shifted in their stalls. The children pressed against their mothers. Atrahasis sat beside the sealed door with his hand on the bitumen, feeling the vibrations of a world dissolving on the other side. And then, somewhere on that endless gray water, a dark shape appeared. A boat. Massive, black with pitch, riding low but intact. Inside, crowded together in the smell of animal dung and damp grain and human sweat, were the last living things on earth. Atrahasis and his family, the craftsmen, the animals, and the clay tablets that held the memory of everything lost. The waters receded slowly. It took days. The mountaintops appeared first, dark points emerging from the gray surface like the tips of fingers reaching up from below. The boat drifted toward one of these peaks and ran aground with a low, scraping sound that echoed through the hull. Atrahasis opened a hatch in the upper deck and looked out at a world scoured clean. He released a dove. It flew out over the water, circled and returned. There was nowhere for it to land. He waited, then sent a swallow. It too came back, wings heavy with moisture. Finally, he released a raven. The black bird flew out over the flood and did not return. Somewhere, land had emerged. Somewhere, there was solid ground again. Atrahasis stepped out onto the wet stone of the mountaintop and breathed air that tasted of nothing. No dust, no smoke, no human scent. The world was empty and clean and silent, and the silence was the most terrible thing he had ever heard. He knelt on the stone and began to prepare a sacrifice. If there were gods still watching, he would give them a reason to look. Chapter 13, The Bargain of Mortality. The gods came to the smoke, like flies to honey. And in the argument that followed, the future of every human being who would ever live was decided on a rain-washed mountaintop. Atrahasis built a fire on the mountaintop from the driest wood he could find aboard the boat. He slaughtered a lamb, one of the precious few animals that had survived, and laid it on the flames. He poured beer over the altar stones and set bundles of dried reeds alight, sending columns of sweet-smelling smoke rising into the empty sky above the receding water. The gods smelled the smoke. The texts describe what happened next with an image so vivid it has survived for nearly 4,000 years. The gods gathered around the offering like flies. They crowded in from the upper heavens, drawn by the scent of roasting meat and burning cedar, starving after 7 days without a single offering from the drowned earth below. They descended on the sacrifice with a hunger that stripped away every pretense of divine dignity. These were the rulers of the universe, the shapers of creation, the beings who held the tablet of destinies and governed the movements of the stars. And they were jostling each other for a mouthful of smoke and the lingering scent of cooked meat on a wet and empty mountaintop. Enlil arrived last. When the wind god saw the boat, saw the humans standing alive on the mountainside, saw the other gods crowded around a sacrifice that should not have existed, his fury was volcanic. Someone had betrayed the oath. Someone had warned these creatures. The flood, The absolute, final, undeniable flood had failed. Humanity had survived. He knew who was responsible. His eyes found Enki in the crowd of gods, and the accusation needed no words. The water god met his gaze without flinching. For a long moment, the two most powerful gods in creation stared at each other across the smoke of the sacrifice. Storm against water, force against cleverness, destruction against preservation. Enki spoke first. His voice was calm. The voice of underground springs, steady and unhurried, impossible to rush. He reminded Enlil of the hunger the gods had felt during the flood. He reminded him of the younger gods who had once rebelled against their labor. He asked a simple question that cut through every layer of divine anger. Who would do the work? Without humans, the gods would labor again. Without human offerings, the gods would starve again. Without human hands to build the temples and tend the fields and bake the bread and weave the cloth, the entire divine order would collapse back into the chaos it had been before Enki organized the world. Humanity was not a luxury. It was a necessity. The argument raged. Enlil stood with the Tablet of Destinies, its surface still inscribed with the decree of annihilation. Enki countered with the power of the water of life, the generative force that had animated the first humans, and that Enlil, for all his authority, could not control. The two forces pressed against each other, storm and spring, and the assembled gods chose sides. Some stood with Enlil, the queen of the underworld, Ereshkigal, and Nergal, the death god. They favored the end of humanity. Others stood with Enki, Ishtar, who had wept during the flood, the younger gods who feared a return to labor. Even some of the senior Anunnaki, who had grown comfortable with their offerings and did not wish to give them up. The stalemate was broken by the voice of Anu, the distant father god, who rarely spoke and whose word carried the weight of the oldest authority in creation. He told his children to stop fighting. He told them to find a solution. He reminded them that the power to determine destiny had been given to them not for argument, but for governance. It was Enki who proposed the compromise. His voice was gentle, careful, shaped with the precision of a craftsman fitting a joint. The old humanity, strong, ageless, endlessly fertile, would indeed perish, as Enlil's decree demanded. The Tablet of Destinies would be honored, but a new humanity would be created in its place, and this new humanity would be different. They would die, not immediately, not violently, but inevitably. Every human being would carry within them a limit, a span of years beyond which the body could not sustain itself. The old humans had been functionally immortal, dying only by disease or violence. The new humans would age. Their hair would gray, their joints would stiffen, their breath would shorten, and in the end, quietly, they would stop. Their fertility would be reduced. Not all pregnancies would succeed. Some children would be born still. Some women would be unable to conceive at all. Certain priestesses would be forbidden from bearing children entirely. The population would grow, but slowly. Slowly enough that the noise would never again reach the level that had driven Enlil to destroy the world. And they would suffer, not as punishment, but as limitation. Disease would touch them, grief would find them. The brevity of their lives would make every choice urgent and every loss permanent. They would be, in every way that mattered, fragile. And that fragility would keep them humble, and their humility would keep them quiet, and their quiet would let Enlil sleep. Enlil considered the offer. The compromise satisfied his decree without requiring the gods to return to their own labor. The old humanity would end. The new humanity would be contained. His sleep would be protected. After a long silence, during which even the wind seemed to hold its breath, the wind god accepted. Atrahasis received one final gift. Because he had been faithful, because he had listened to the wall and built the boat and saved the seed of life, the gods granted him what they would grant no other human being. Immortality. He was renamed Utnapishtim, he who found life, and sent to live at the edge of the world, far from both gods and men. It was a gift with teeth. Utnapishtim would live forever, but he would live alone. The new humans, mortal and brief, would regard him as something alien, a relic of an age that had passed. He would watch generations rise and fall from a distance that no conversation could bridge. The last of the old humans, preserved in amber, enduring while everything around him changed and changed and changed. The gods descended from the mountaintop. The waters continued to recede. Somewhere in the mud of the drowned world, the first seeds of the new humanity took root. Weaker, shorter-lived, more prone to sorrow than their predecessors, but alive. Carrying within them the blood of a sacrificed god, the clay of the deep earth, and a stubborn will to survive that no flood had managed to break. Chapter 14. Inanna and the Theft of Civilization. The youngest goddess wanted more than she had been given. So she dressed in her finest garments, sailed south to the oldest city, and drank the god of wisdom under his own table. Uruk was Inanna's city. It sat along the Euphrates, north of Eridu, and it was growing, spreading outward from its central temple the way a tree spreads from its trunk. But Inanna was not content with growth alone. She looked south toward Eridu, where Enki kept the Emi in his underwater temple, and she saw everything her city lacked: kingship, music, the art of the scribe. The Emi were the foundation of civilized life. Without them, Uruk could grow larger but never greater. It could build taller walls and wider streets, but it would remain a city without depth, a body without a heart. Inanna understood this with the ruthless clarity that was her particular gift. She did not wish to beg. She did not wish to negotiate. She wished to take. She prepared herself with the care of a general planning a campaign. She bathed in sacred water. She lined her eyes with kohl made from ground antimony. She dressed in her finest garments, a robe of lapis lazuli blue, a breastplate of golden beads, a crown of steppe flowers that framed her face like a second sun. When Inanna prepared to go somewhere, the world noticed. She told her faithful servant Ninshubur to wait at the gate of Uruk. If Inanna did not return within 3 days, Ninshubur was to seek help from the gods, first Enlil, then Nanna, then Enki himself. This instruction would save Inanna's life in a later story. For now, it was simply the caution of a goddess who understood that even divine plans can go wrong. Inanna sailed south on a reed boat, following the Euphrates through the flat marshlands toward the oldest city in the world. The journey took her past fishing villages and date groves, past fields of ripening barley, and herds of cattle standing knee-deep in canal water. The air grew warmer. The reeds grew taller, and at the edge of the southern marshes, the walls of Eridu appeared. Enki received her warmly. He welcomed Inanna into the Abzu with the hospitality that sacred tradition demanded. A banquet was prepared. Beer was poured into cups of polished stone. Dates and roasted fish and fresh bread were laid on mats of woven reed. The two gods sat across from each other in the cool lamplight of the underwater temple and began to drink. They drank. In the Sumerian poem that preserves this story, the drinking is described with a kind of amused precision. Enki drank deeply. He drank with the confidence of a god who had never been outwitted. He drank because the beer was good, and the company was beautiful, and the evening stretched before him like a calm river. Inanna drank too, but carefully, watching, keeping count. As the cups emptied and were refilled, Enki's tongue loosened. The god of wisdom, the keeper of secrets, the guardian of the Emi, began to give things away. One by one, with the expansive generosity of a man deep in his cups, he offered the divine decrees to his guest. Kingship. He gave her kingship. Priesthood. He gave her that too. The art of the hero, the art of power, the art of treachery, the art of straightforwardness. Truth. Falsehood. The craft of the woodworker, the craft of the coppersmith, the craft of the scribe, the craft of the leatherworker, the art of song, the knowledge of purification rites, the sacred drum, the sacred robe, the descent to the underworld, the ascent from the underworld. More than 100 ME, one after another, lifted from their places in the treasury of the deep and placed into Inanna's open hands. The god of wisdom gave away the foundations of civilization, like a man, tossing coins to street musicians, laughing, pouring more beer, never once pausing to consider what the morning would look like when the cups were cleared. Inanna did not wait for morning. While Enki slept, collapsed across the banquet table, his hand still wrapped around an empty cup, she gathered every he had given and carried them to the dock. She loaded them onto the boat of heaven in haste, one armful after another, until the vessel sat low in the water under the weight of an entire civilization. She pushed off from the dock and sailed north before the first light of dawn touched the surface of the marsh. Behind her, the Abzu was silent. The god of wisdom snored in his banquet hall. The treasury was empty, and a goddess with a boat full of stolen power was racing up the Euphrates toward a city that was about to become the center of the world. Enki woke with a headache and a terrible clarity. He called for his servant. He asked about the ME. The answer was exactly what he feared. He sent creatures after her, sea monsters and storm demons dispatched to intercept the boat of heaven at 7 points along the river. Each meantime, Ninshuber, faithful, tireless Ninshuber, drove the creatures back with divine force. At each waypoint, the attacks grew fiercer. Waves rose from the river. Serpents coiled around the hull. But Ninshuber stood at the bow of the boat of heaven with arms raised, invoking the authority of the gods who had sanctioned Inanna's journey, and the creatures fell back into the water, one by one. The ME stayed aboard. The boat sailed on. The boat reached Uruk at dusk. The city gates were thrown open. The people lined the canal banks, singing as Inanna stepped ashore with the ME in her arms. Kingship had come to Uruk. Music had come. Writing and law and the sacred rites of the temple had come. The city that had been a body without a heart now possessed everything it needed to become great. Enki, sitting alone in his empty treasury, stared at the water flowing through his temple floor and said nothing. The god of wisdom had been outwitted by the goddess of ambition. It was not the last time the old order would be overturned by the young. In this mythology, the cleverest plans are sometimes undone by someone who simply wants something more than you want to keep it. Chapter 15, Kingship descends from heaven. With the ME now held in mortal cities, the age of divine rule gave way to the age of kings, and the first great names were pressed into clay. The Sumerian king list begins with 5 words that carry the weight of a civilization. When kingship descended from heaven. It is one of the oldest historical documents in the world. A clay tablet inscribed with the names of every ruler the Sumerians remembered, stretching back before the flood into an age when kings lived for thousands of years. The first city to receive kingship was Eridu. This made sense. Eridu was the oldest city, the seat of Enki, the place where the ME had originally been kept. After Eridu came Bad Tabira, then Larak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak. 5 cities before the flood. 5 seats of divine rule in an age when the boundary between gods and mortals was thinner than a reed wall. The kings of that antediluvian age were recorded with lifespans that stagger the imagination. One king ruled for 43,200 years, another for 36,000. These numbers were not meant literally. They were expressions of a sacred mathematics, a way of saying that the age before the flood was immeasurably long, and its rulers were closer to gods than to men. Then the flood came. The king list records this with devastating brevity. The flood swept over. Everything before that line belongs to the mythic past. Everything after it belongs to the world the listener has been living in all along, the world of mortal kings, shorter reigns, smaller numbers, and the slow, steady accumulation of recorded human history. After the flood, kingship descended again, this time to Kish. The first post-flood dynasty included kings whose names sound less like myths and more like men. Jushur, Kulas-Sinabel, Nangish-Lishma. Their reigns were still long by mortal standards, but they were shrinking. The world was becoming more recognizable. The gods were withdrawing from direct rule, leaving governance to human hands. In the cities that grew along the rivers, a new kind of life was taking shape. At the center of each city stood the temple, not merely a place of worship, but the economic and administrative heart of the community. The temple owned land. The temple employed scribes and brewers and weavers. The temple stored grain against famine and lent seed to farmers in the spring. Rising above each temple was the ziggurat, a terraced tower of mud brick, painted white and sometimes topped with a small shrine in which the city's patron god was said to rest. From the top of the ziggurat at you could see the flat marshland stretching to the horizon in every direction, broken only by the silver thread of the Euphrates and the green lines of irrigated fields. The people who lived in these cities were farmers and fishermen, potters and metalworkers, priests and soldiers and scribes. They ate bread and dates and onions. They drank beer through long reed straws from communal jars. They married and quarreled and raised children and buried their dead beneath the floors of their own houses, close to the family, even in death. From Kish, kingship passed to Uruk. The city Inanna had filled with the stolen Emi. It was in Uruk that the greatest names of Sumerian legend appeared. Enmerkar, who built the city's walls and established trade with distant lands. Lugalbanda, the shepherd king, who walked with gods and spoke with animals. And after Lugalbanda came his son, the most famous name in Mesopotamian history. Gilgamesh. The king list records him simply. Gilgamesh, whose father was a phantom, lord of Kulab, reigned for 126 years. His mother was the goddess Ninsun, wise, gentle, a reader of dreams. His father was said to be Lugalbanda, though some traditions call him a phantom or a spirit. Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, an impossible fraction that expressed an impossible truth. He was the strongest man who had ever lived. He could wrestle any warrior to the ground and lift stones no other king could move. He built the great walls of Uruk, walls so vast that later generations attributed them to the gods. But strength without restraint is tyranny, and Gilgamesh, for all his power, had not yet learned what it meant to rule with wisdom. The people of Uruk suffered under him. He took what he wanted, conscripting young men for building projects without end and claiming privileges over the women of the city that no king should claim. The people cried out, not to Gilgamesh, who would not listen, but to the gods above. They asked for someone who could match his strength and teach him to be human. The gods heard, and in their answer, in the creation of a wild man made of clay, sent to walk with Gilgamesh and change him from the inside. The final and greatest story of Mesopotamian mythology would begin. But that is a story that deserves its own space, its own silence, its own slow unfolding in the dark. For now, the world had its shape. The Emmy governed every craft and law. Kingship had descended from heaven and settled into mortal hands. Cities rose along the rivers. With its great ziggurat, Lagash with its canals, Nippur with its sacred temple of Enlil. Scribes pressed the names of the gods into wet clay, and the clay dried in the sun, and the stories hardened into permanence. And in every temple, in every city, the scribes kept writing. They wrote lists of kings and lists of gods. They wrote hymns to Inanna and prayers to Enlil. They wrote contracts for the sale of barley and the rental of fields. They wrote letters from merchants to their wives and receipts for jars of beer delivered to temple storerooms. The world was being recorded, one tablet at a time. The age of myths was slowly becoming the age of history, but it was not finished yet. There were still descents to be made, into the underworld, into grief, into the furthest reaches of the known world. And the gods, though they ruled less directly now, were far from done with the small, noisy, mortal creatures they had made from blood and clay. Chapter 16. Inanna's Descent to the Underworld. The Queen of Heaven set her heart on the great below. She dressed in all her power, walked through 7 gates, and arrived before the throne of death, wearing nothing at all. Inanna turned her ear to the great below. That is how the Sumerian poem begins, with the goddess of love and war choosing to descend into the one place from which no god or mortal had ever returned, the underworld. Kur, the land of dust and silence and forgetting, the most restless deity in creation, was walking toward the one place that never moved. Why she went is a question the texts leave unanswered. Some versions say she went to attend the funeral of Gugalana, the bull of heaven, husband of her elder sister Ereshkigal. Others suggest she went to extend her power into the one realm beyond her reach. Perhaps both reasons are true. Perhaps neither explains the hunger that drove her downward into the dark. Before she left, she prepared. She put on every piece of divine regalia, the Shugura crown upon her head, the lapis necklace around her throat, the double strand of beads across her chest, the golden breastplate over her heart, the measuring rod in her hand, the royal robe around her body, the kohl upon her eyes. Each item was a piece of her power made visible. Then she went to Ninshubur and gave instructions that carried the weight of a last will. If Inanna did not return within 3 days, Ninshubur was to dress in mourning, beat the drum in the assembly of the gods, and seek help, first from Enlil, then from Nanna, and if all others refused, from Enki, the god who never turned away from a problem. Inanna walked to the gate of the underworld. It was set into the earth like a mouth in the side of a hill, dark stone framing a passage that grew colder with every step. She knocked. She announced herself. She demanded entry in the name of the Queen of Heaven, and her voice echoed down the corridors like a stone dropped into a deep well. The gatekeeper reported to Ereshkigal. The Queen of the Dead did not welcome the news. Her sister, the bright one, the powerful one, was demanding entry into the realm of dust. Ereshkigal's face darkened. She gave the gatekeeper instructions that would become the most famous sequence in Sumerian literature. "Let her in," she said, "but at each gate remove one of her garments." There were 7 gates. At the first, the gatekeeper removed Inanna's crown, the Shugura, mark of her sovereignty. She protested. The gatekeeper replied with words that would be repeated at every threshold. "Be quiet, Inanna. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned." And the crown was taken, and the goddess walked on, diminished. At the second gate, the lapis necklace was lifted from her throat. At the third, the beads from her chest. At the fourth, the breastplate from over her heart. At the fifth, the measuring rod from her hands. At the sixth, the bracelets from her wrists. At the 7th and final gate, The royal robe was drawn from her body, and she passed through naked. Not merely unclothed, stripped of every instrument of her power. The crown that marked sovereignty, gone. The symbols of authority, gone. The beauty she had weaponized since the dawn of creation, reduced to bare skin in cold air. She stood before her sister's throne as vulnerable as any mortal who had ever died, and the stone beneath her feet was as cold as forgetting. Ereshkigal sat in the great hall of the underworld. Around her stood the 7 Anunnaki of the dead, judges whose word could not be appealed, whose gaze carried the weight of finality. They looked at Inanna with eyes that held no warmth. They fixed upon her the eye of death. And Inanna, goddess of love and war, died on the cold floor of her sister's court. Her corpse was hung on a hook on the wall, a body on a meat hook, displayed like butchered mutton in a market stall. The Queen of Heaven, reduced to dead weight in a dark room. The underworld had claimed her, and the silence that followed was the silence of a world that had lost something it did not yet know how to name. 3 days passed. On the surface, love faltered. Desire faded. Flowers stopped opening in the gardens of Uruk. Animals ceased to mate. Human beings looked at one another with dull indifference. The goddess of passion was dead, and her absence pressed against every living thing like a hand pressing the air from a room. Ninshubur did exactly as instructed. She went to Enlil. He refused. Inanna had chosen her path. She went to Nanna. The moon god refused too. No one wished to challenge the laws of the great below. Finally, she went to Enki. The god of wisdom listened. He did not turn her away. Instead, he reached beneath his own fingernails. From the dirt that accumulates in the hands of a god who works with clay, Enki fashioned 2 small beings, neither male nor female, barely visible, designed to slip through the cracks of the underworld's defenses unnoticed. He gave them the food of life and the water of life, and sent them below with a single instruction: listen to Ereshkigal's pain. The queen of the dead was suffering, groaning with something that resembled labor or grief, alone in her dark hall. When the 2 creatures found her, they did not demand or threaten. They echoed her cries. When she groaned, they groaned. When she wept, they wept. Ereshkigal, who had never been met with compassion, was moved enough to offer a gift. They asked for the corpse. Bound by her own laws of hospitality, Ereshkigal gave it to them. They sprinkled the food of life upon Inanna's body. They sprinkled the water of life. Color returned to her skin. Warmth crept back into her limbs. Her eyes opened, fierce, bright, calculating. The eyes of a goddess who had died and refused to stay dead. Inanna was alive again. Chapter 17, Dumuzi and the Price of Return. No one leaves the underworld without a substitute. And when Inanna rose from death, the demons followed her, demanding a life in exchange for her own. The law of the underworld was absolute and older than any god who enforced it. No one who entered the great below could leave without providing a replacement, another soul to take their place in the dust of the dead. Inanna had been revived, but the debt remained unpaid. Someone would have to descend in her stead, and the creatures who enforced this law were already at her heels. The Gala followed her upward. They were demons of the underworld, small, relentless, incapable of pity. They did not eat or drink or sleep. They could not be bribed or frightened. Their only purpose was to ensure the laws of the dead were honored, and they clung to Inanna's shadow like dogs following a butcher through a crowded market square. As Inanna climbed back through the 7 gates, her garments were returned one by one: crown, necklace, beads, breastplate, rod, bracelets, robe. By the time she emerged into sunlight, she was radiant and restored, fully clothed in power again. But the Gala were still there behind her, patient and silent, waiting for a name. They came first to Ninshubur, who was sitting in the dust in mourning clothes, still grieving. The Gala reached for her. Inanna stopped them. Not this one. Ninshubur had wept. She had beaten the drum. She had walked from god to god, begging for help. She had earned her life with loyalty, and Inanna would not surrender her. They came to Shara, sitting in the dirt, in rags, weeping. The Gala reached again. Not this one. They came to Lulal, also prostrate with grief. Not this one. Inanna spared every servant and attendant who had mourned her death, every person whose grief proved that her absence had mattered to them. The Gala waited. They were patient. A name would come. Then they came to Uruk. And there, in Inanna's own temple, seated upon her throne in splendid robes, they found Dumuzi, her husband, the shepherd god, lord of the date harvest. He was not in mourning, he was not weeping. He sat on her throne like a man who had found his wife's absence convenient, his face calm, his robes immaculate. Inanna looked at him. The texts say she fixed him with the eye of death, the same gaze the judges of the underworld had turned on her. Whatever love had existed between them, whatever tenderness the goddess of passion had felt for the god of green things, it burned away in that single look. She pointed at Dumuzi and spoke 2 words to the Gala. "Take him." Dumuzi ran. The gentle shepherd god fled from his wife's judgment with the desperation of a man who knows that running will not be enough. He called out to the sun god Utu and begged to be transformed. Utu changed him into a snake, slippery and fast, and Dumuzi vanished into the reeds and tall grass of the marshland. The Gala found him. They always found their quarry. They dragged him from the reed beds and bound him for the journey below. His sister, Inanna, goddess of wine and dreams and the written word, saw what was happening and threw herself before the demons. She offered to take her brother's place. Not forever, but for half the year. The Gala considered. A full soul for half the year was not a perfect exchange, but the underworld's laws allowed for division. Inanna's offer was accepted. Brother and sister would share the sentence between them, each spending half the turning year in the land of the dead, each returning to the world above when the other descended. The debt was paid in halves. The bargain was struck. For 6 months, Dumuzi would sit in the dust of the underworld, and the earth above would mourn. Crops withering, falling, orchards standing bare, the land entering the long sleep that the Sumerians knew as the dry season. The world would grieve for the god who had gone below, and every living thing would feel his absence. For the other 6 months, Inanna would take his place, and Dumuzi would rise. He would return the way green shoots push through buried seeds, and the earth would wake with him. Fields would bloom. Date palms would hang heavy with fruit. Sheep would bear their lambs. Spring would return, carrying the warmth of a world that had learned, through loss, to treasure what it had. In the cities of Sumer, the people marked this turning with ritual and song. When the dry season came, and the fields went brown, they sang laments for Dumuzi, songs of grief so beautiful that later generations preserved them on clay tablets that survive to this day. And when the rains returned and the first green appeared, they celebrated his return with festivals of music and abundance. This was the origin of the seasons, not the tilt of an axis, not the geometry of an orbit, but a cycle of grief and reunion, a husband taken, a sister's sacrifice, a goddess whose rage turned the wheel of the year. The Sumerians understood their seasons as something felt in the body and the heart, not measured by instruments or calculated by the mind. And so the great myth of Inanna reached its close, the goddess who stole civilization, who descended through 7 gates, who died and condemned her own husband. She was the most human of all the gods. Her story was about desire and consequence, about the cost of power and the price of returning from a place where nothing is meant to return. The underworld had its balance, the seasons had their rhythm, and in Uruk, where Inanna's temple caught the first light of the morning star, the people prepared for the final story, the one about a king who could not accept that even the mightiest of mortals must one day descend into the dust and never come back. Chapter 18, Gilgamesh and the Plant of Immortality. The mightiest king in the world watched his dearest friend die and walked to the edge of existence, searching for the one thing no mortal was ever meant to find. Before Enkidu, Gilgamesh had never loved anything he could not command. He was the king of Uruk, strongest man alive, builder of walls that would outlast generations. But he was a tyrant, restless, unsatisfied, using his power without wisdom. The people had prayed for someone to match him, and the gods answered with a creature shaped from clay and set loose in the wild. Enkidu was born in the steppe, among gazelles and wild asses. He was covered in hair, muscled like a bull, innocent of everything civilization had made: clothing, bread, beer, language, law. He drank at the watering holes with animals and ran with the herds across open plain. He was everything Gilgamesh was not: wild where the king was refined, gentle where the king was harsh. They met in conflict. Enkidu blocked Gilgamesh's path at the door of a wedding house, refusing to let the king claim his unjust privilege. They fought in the street, two extraordinary bodies locked together, shaking the walls around them, neither willing to yield. When it ended, neither had won. And in that draw, something shifted between them forever. They became friends, not in the distant way of kings and courtiers, but in the transforming way that happens when two people recognize in each other the thing they have been missing. Gilgamesh found a companion who could match his strength. Enkidu found a world larger than the steppe had shown him. Together, they were more than either had been alone. They journeyed to the cedar forest and slew its guardian, the terrifying Humbaba. They killed the bull of heaven, sent by the gods to punish Gilgamesh for refusing Inanna's advances. They stood together against every force the divine world sent against them. They were magnificent, and the songs the poets would compose about them would last for thousands of years. Then the gods decided one of them had to die. The killing of Humbaba and the bull of heaven had gone too far. The divine assembly convened, and the sentence fell on Enkidu, not on the king, because kings were useful. Enkidu, the wild man, the one shaped from clay to begin with, would return to the earth from which he had been made. For 12 days he lay in Gilgamesh's palace, growing weaker, his body returning to clay. Gilgamesh sat beside him. He held his hand. He watched the light leave the only eyes that had ever truly seen him. When Enkidu died, Gilgamesh did not move from his side for a day and a night, until a worm fell from the dead man's nose, and the truth could no longer be denied. The grief that followed was vast. Gilgamesh tore off his royal robes, dressed in animal skins, and wandered into the wilderness, not as a king, but as a broken man fleeing the one truth he could not wrestle into submission. He was going to die. Someday, death would come for him, and he would not accept it. He decided to find Utnapishtim, the one mortal granted immortality, the flood survivor who lived at the edge of the world. If anyone knew the secret of escaping death, it was him. Gilgamesh set his face toward the horizon and walked, and the road he followed would take him farther from the human world than any mortal had ever gone. He came to the twin mountains of Mashu, where the sun entered the earth each evening. The gate was guarded by scorpion beings, creatures whose radiance was terrifying, whose bodies were half human and half armored insect. They saw a gaunt man in animal skins, burning with desperation, and against their better judgment they let him pass through the mountain. For 12 leagues he walked in absolute darkness, the tunnel through which the sun traveled each night. He walked by feel, by faith, by the stubborn refusal to stop that had defined his entire life. At the tunnel's end, he emerged into a garden where the trees bore fruit of carnelian and lapis lazuli, and vines hung with jewels that clinked like bells in the wind. Beside a shore that opened onto the waters of Defoth sat a woman named Siduri. She kept a tavern at the edge of existence. She looked at the wild-eyed king and asked why he was so worn with grief. Gilgamesh told her about Enkidu, about his fear, about the silence that death would bring. Siduri listened, then offered the gentlest wisdom in all of ancient literature. "Let your belly be full," she said. "Wash yourself. Hold the child that takes your hand. Let your wife delight in your embrace. This is the task the gods have set for human beings. Enjoy your days. The life you seek you will not find, for when the gods made humanity, they kept death as humanity's share and held life in their own hands." Gilgamesh could not listen. The grief was too large, the fear too sharp. He pressed on, found the ferryman Urshanabi, and crossed the waters of death, a black, still expanse that dissolved anything living that touched it. They punted across with stone poles, each discarded after a single push, and reached the far shore where Utnapishtim sat. The old man was quiet and unremarkable. He told Gilgamesh the story of the flood, the same story the listener has already heard. He said his immortality was a gift never to be repeated. But he offered one test: stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights. If you cannot master sleep, the little brother of death, how can you master death itself? Gilgamesh sat down, determined. Within minutes, exhaustion took him. He slept for 6 days. When he woke, the proof of his failure lay beside him. Loaves of bread placed by Utnapishtim's wife each day, marking the time he could not resist. The first loaf was hard and stale. The last was still warm. He had failed completely. But Utnapishtim's wife, moved by grief, persuaded her husband to offer a final gift. A thorny plant grew at the bottom of the sea that could restore youth. Not immortality, but renewal. Gilgamesh tied stones to his feet, dove to the ocean floor, and pulled the plant from the seabed with bleeding hands. He held it against his chest like something sacred. He carried it back across the waters of death, through the mountain of the sun. He was going home. He would test the plant in Uruk, perhaps give it to the elders first, watch their hair darken and their backs straighten. For the first time in months, something moved in his chest that felt almost like hope. They stopped to rest beside a cool pool. Gilgamesh set the plant on the bank and waded in to bathe. While he was in the water, a serpent smelled the plant's fragrance. It slithered from the rocks, took the plant, and vanished into a crack in the earth. As it disappeared, it shed its old skin, renewed, rejuvenated, carrying away the gift meant for a king. Gilgamesh sat beside the empty bank and wept for the last time. The plant was gone. Immortality was impossible. Youth was stolen. Enkidu was dead and would remain dead. And Gilgamesh himself would one day join him in the underworld where the dust settles on everything and nothing returns. He went home. When he reached Uruk, he stopped at the city gate and looked up at the walls he had built, massive fired bricks stretching in a circuit of nearly 10 kilometers. He turned to Urshanabi and said, "Look at these walls. Examine the foundation. Inspect the brickwork. Is it not fine?" The walls were enough, not forever. But they were real, and they were his. What endures is not the man, but what the man builds. Not the breath, but the wall. Not the heartbeat, but the story pressed into clay. Gilgamesh returned to his city and ruled it well. The poems say he became the kind of king his people had always needed. Strong but wise, powerful but restrained. And when he died, Uruk mourned as it had never mourned before. The stories are finished now, and you have traveled a long way tonight. From the dark water before creation to the walls of a city built by a king who learned, just in time, that being mortal is not a punishment. It is the shape of a human life, and within that shape there is room for everything that matters. These are the oldest stories ever written down. They were pressed into clay by scribes who sat in courtyards lit by oil lamps, recording words that had been spoken around cooking fires and temple altars for generations before the first stylus was cut. The tablets are mostly broken now, cracked and worn by nearly 5,000 years in the dry soil of what is now Iraq. But enough survives. Enough to hear a mother warning her daughter about a river where a dangerous god walks. Enough to hear a goddess knocking on the gate of the underworld and demanding entry. Enough to hear a wise man listening to a voice that comes through a wall of reeds. Enough to hear a king looking at his city's walls and deciding that what he built is enough. The Tigris and the Euphrates still flow through the land where these stories were first told. The sky above holds the same stars the Sumerians watched and named. The marshes in the south still fill with water birds at dusk, and the reeds bend in the evening wind the way they have always bent. The way they bent when Enki first taught the rivers where to flow. The people who told these stories are gone. Their cities are mounds of earth in a quiet plain. Their language fell silent thousands of years ago. But the stories survived, because stories pressed into clay are harder to destroy than the civilizations that made them. What the scribes wrote endured. What the kings built crumbled. The clay outlasted the stone. Let these old stories settle into the quiet of your night. Let the water close over them gently, the way the Euphrates closes over a stone dropped from a bridge. The gods are resting. The kings have set down their crowns. The walls of Uruk stand in the starlight, and somewhere at the edge of the world, an old man watches the water and says nothing. If these stories brought you some rest tonight, some wonder, or the simple comfort of a voice in the dark, we are glad. We will be here with another story whenever you return. Until then, sleep well. The oldest water in the world is still turning in the deep, patient as it has always been, carrying everything forward, carrying everything home.